In a world where our self-appointed cultural overlords seem to think history began in around 2004, a world in which we're always being lectured not to celebrate great achievements of the past because something racism or something, it becomes more important than ever to celebrate those achievements and the men and the women who achieved them, lest our younger generations who are constantly being browbeaten from kindergarten all the way through grad school with narratives that say America sucks, America is evil, and so on, then they'll become grown adults with no cultural memory and no historical perspective of which to speak. And when that happens, our culture will become dead. So with this in mind, today marks the 50th anniversary of one of humanity's and America's greatest achievements ever. For on 30 July 1971, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin of Apollo 15 guided their lunar module Falcon to a pinpoint landing in the Hadley Apennine Valley, becoming the fourth crew to land safely upon the surface of the moon. We've talked numerous times before about how the average American doesn't even tend to realize that there was more than one moon landing, much less 6. And when the Apollo program is discussed by people who are non-spaceflight enthusiasts, more often than not it takes the form of some idiot first denying that men have ever walked on the moon, while some slightly less idiotic idiot on the other side steadfastly argues that the moon landing was totally legit. And it's a good shorthand for gauging the ignorance level of the person with whom you're dealing, because if they use the singular and say, the moon landing, even if they are arguing for the legitimacy of the event, then you're dealing with a person who is, shall we say, not likely to be a first ballot inductee into the Intellectual Hall of Fame. Well, the Apollo lunar missions were, and remain, the greatest achievements in the history of mankind. You'll notice I didn't put any qualifier in between greatest and achievements because there should be no qualifier. They weren't the greatest technical achievements, though they were also that. They weren't the greatest explorational achievements, though they also were that. They were the greatest things, full stop, that human beings have ever done. 24 men flew to the moon. 12 of them walked on its surface. All of them were returned safely to the Earth. All of them were Americans. And in the 48 and one-half years since the end of the final Apollo lunar mission, no nation has duplicated any aspect of what our nation and that program and the men and women in that program, from the mission commanders right down to the janitorial staff at the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, achieved between July of 1969 and December of 1972. And for people who are lacking in knowledge about the program and its missions, they might shrug and say, well, the fourth landing, who cares about the fourth landing? Wasn't this stuff all a walk in the park by the time they got to the fourth one? And the answer to that question is no, it was not. Why? Well, for starters, the Apollo 15 crew, they were less than a year from their launch date when they found out, right out of the blue, all that they were going to be flying a completely different mission than the one they'd been training for all this time. 15 was supposed to be a G mission, meaning there's no lunar rover, there's no serious field geology, basically it's a slightly longer and more extensive version of the whole footprints and flag routine. You walk around, you pick up some rocks, you stick the flag in the ground, you take a few pictures, you deploy a few experiments, and that's mostly it. And that's what Apollo 15 was originally supposed to be. That's the mission that Dave Scott and Jim Irwin and Al Worden, the command module pilot, had been training for the previous 12 months. But then Walter Mondale and his anti-Apollo cabal of senators succeeded in getting the last 3 missions, Apollos 18, 19, and 20, canceled. All the hardware had been built, the launch vehicles were ready to go, the crews had been assigned, they were already deep into their training. But Mondale and the boys, they just couldn't justify the expense of 3 more flights. And yes, I know it sounds very strange that there was once a world where congressional Democrats cared about government spending, but I digress. So all of a sudden, missions number 15, 16, and 17 became J missions instead of G missions. So that means a vastly longer stay on the lunar surface, 3 EVAs instead of 2, and of course the first ever deployment of the lunar roving vehicle. And with a longer surface stay, that means you need to carry more consumables, which means your vehicle weighs more, which means you need to put a bigger descent engine on the lunar module. Oh, And your landing site is in a completely different place now. So you're going to be landing a vehicle whose flight characteristics will be markedly different from the vehicle you thought you were going to be landing, the one you've been practicing landing in the simulator for over a year. Oh, and you also need to become a qualified geological field observer too, because the whole point of bringing the LRV is so you can go farther afield from the landing site and hopefully find more interesting samples to collect. So you've got 8 months from today to do all of this. Go. And remember, until we actually went to the moon and collected an assortment of samples and brought them back for analysis, we didn't have the faintest idea how the moon got there or even what the hell it was made of. And it was Apollo 15 that sealed the deal on that when they collected the sample that came to be known as the Genesis rock, that little fist-sized hunk of anorthosite. It taught us more about the origins of the moon and by extension the Earth and by extension the entire solar system than we had learned in the previous 50,000 years since man first stood upright and looked up at the big white disk in the night sky. Now, Dave Scott, I'm happy to report, is still going strong. Having recently celebrated his 89th birthday, he's one of only 4 moonwalkers who are still living. And the only mission commander, sadly. Al Worden just died last year. Too bad he didn't make it to the 50th anniversary, although he and Dave Scott absolutely detested one another, so it's not like they would have been making any joint appearances anyway. Worden hated Scott so much that he wouldn't even say his name in interviews. He would refer only to him as the commander of that flight. Jim Irwin, as it turns out, was the first moonwalker to die in 1993 at the age of 61 from his 4th heart attack. Or should I say, his 4th official heart attack, because the NASA flight surgeons were pretty sure he had a heart attack on the way to the moon on Apollo 15. The astronauts, of course, were hooked up to biomed sensors 100% of the time during a flight, and so their vital signs were always being monitored by the flight surgeons back in Houston. And during the 3rd day of the flight, Jim Irwin's EKG started going all haywire, so showing sudden fits of cardiac dysrhythmia. The flight surgeons became very alarmed, obviously. And they went and told Chris Kraft about it, who was the head honcho at Mission Control. And how do you phrase that one when you take it to the flight director? Sir, I think one of our astronauts is having a myocardial infarction on the way to the moon, which is a hell of a thing to have happen when you're 2/3 of the way there already. But rather than immediately aborting the mission, which some people wanted him to do, Kraft first asked the flight surgeon. He said, if this patient were in front of you right now, how would you be treating him? And the flight surgeon says, well, if he was on Earth, I would have him immobilized in an ICU on pure oxygen, hooked up to a heart monitor. And Kraft says, you mean just like he is right now in the spacecraft? So everybody agreed to just sit back and see what happens, and sure enough, Irwin's heart eventually quieted down, although they never told him about any of this, which is fun. And the flight was able to proceed nominally. But then they did the first EVA, and Irwin wound up not being able to get any water out of his drink bag. So he went the whole 7.5 hours without a drop of fluids, didn't tell anybody until they were back inside the LEM, and by that time, once again, his EKG started not looking all that great. And it's a matter of some dispute among cardiologists still whether the stresses of that flight contributed ultimately to the 4 heart attacks he suffered during the final 22 years of his life. And since I am not a fancy doctor like Jill Biden, or Ibram X. Kendi, I shall register no opinion on that point. But in my opinion, Mr. Jim Eagle should hit my music right now. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where masks are only required for people with ugly, unattractive faces. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and I have got one question for you. It's the question that all decent people really ought to be asking themselves right now. Just how much of this madness are you going to tolerate? Now, when people like me were saying 1.5 years ago now that it's a really bad idea to acquiesce to these onerous, draconian, unscientific orders from the public health industrial complex, because these are not people who ever give back new powers once they've asserted them. And the names we were called by the ivory tower bureaucrat aristocracy and the performance art news media. You're a bunch of paranoid conspiracy theorists, they bellowed with all the sanctimony they could muster. Dr. Fauci just wants us to be safe, they scolded, in between reminders that simpletons like us, the great unwashed, we must never question the proclamations of people who live in Washington, D.C. and wear white lab coats. And there is nobody who understands this better than our good friend, the White House press secretary, the artist whom we lovingly know as Lady Ginger McFirebush of Alabaster Farms. For when she was asked, during what may be her last ever press briefing, more on that later, to expound upon the scientific rationale whereby her boss, the corpse of former segregationist Senator Joe Biden, decided the reinstatement of mask mandates was something that needed to happen, despite having said the complete opposite thing for his entire presidency up to this point, well, she didn't even try. She just dumped it right at the feet of the CDC, and she used the same sort of language that one might expect from a local priest who just received an unfavorable dispensation from the Vatican. Well, the CDC is, a body, that is, very, well respected, and, we follow the CDC's, guidance. I got a question for you, Red. Who the hell does the CDC work for again? What branch of government is the CDC in? And who's the doddering old hair-sniffing pervert who runs that particular branch of government? Because it's really not a very good look when you're speaking on behalf of the President of the United States and your desire to shift the blame for these moronic, indefensible policies is so all-consuming that you make it sound like Rochelle Walensky, America's top neurotic public health basket case, is Joe Biden's boss. Like the president just sits around waiting for the CDC to say jump so he can ask how high. And Mr. President, if you're watching, please don't actually try to jump, because remember when you thought it would be a good idea to chase your dog in the bathroom and you wound up with a busted foot? And since we're on that subject, I feel like I have to ask, though I suspect I probably don't want to know the answer. Why was your dog in the bathroom with you when you were taking a shower? Because I'm pretty sure that's not normal behavior. For the man or the dog, frankly. So, ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary, aromantic allosexuals, since we are all about diversity and inclusion around here, do you believe me yet that going along with this crap was a terrible idea as our vapid, incompetent leaders drag us kicking and screaming back down into the rabbit hole of mandatory religious face coverings and school closures and lockdowns and vaccine mandates? Are you ready to live for another year in a world where high school kids have to wear surgical masks as they run cross-country races? Why were you ever willing to live in that world in the first place? I at least find myself in a somewhat fortuitous position here since my youngest kid just graduated from high school, so I no longer have any skin directly in the game. Aside, of course, from being a taxpayer who would prefer not to finance the teachings of Vladimir Lenin and Elijah Muhammad at my local elementary school. Are you ready to live for another year in a world where everybody is a faceless zombie instead of a person? Hasn't it been so nice? During what is turning out to be just a brief respite from 15 years to slow the spread, to return to a world of normal social interactions, to be able to express one's thoughts with a smile or a frown, rather than having to elucidate every single thing verbally because half of everyone's face is invisible. And it's not just about the present, either. It's also about the future. In the future, for the rest of your natural-born life, each time you see a picture of a group of people with ridiculous masks on their faces, you're going to say, yep, that's from 2020 or 21. During that protracted episode of government-imposed mass hysteria that we all find so embarrassing now in retrospect. During that period when, to our eternal collective shame, we went along with all that ridiculous nonsense, even though we damn well knew it had no basis in reason or in science. And make no mistake, that is exactly how this period is going to be viewed with the benefit of hindsight. But if you've still got school-aged children, as I am so fortunate to no longer have, because I really think I would have wound up in jail over this shit, frankly, those children are going to be adults one day. And it's going to happen sooner than you think. And what are you going to tell them when they ask you, Mom and Dad, why didn't you do anything when I was forced to play sports while wearing a surgical mask? Or when they ask, Mom and Dad, Why didn't you say anything when the schools were shut down for no goddamn good reason and I had to spend an entire year in my room with a laptop pretending that was school? Or when they ask you, Mom and Dad, why didn't you say anything when the local school board was being taken over by communist race hustlers? Oh, I've stated my belief more than once, and this won't be the last time, that these policies, which were never supported by anything resembling honest scientific inquiry, when you mix them all together in a disgusting cocktail of idiocy and shame, they constitute the most unconscionable act of mass child abuse in the history of the modern world. We have no way of knowing for sure because our public health agencies have been co-opted to serve the political interests of the Democrat Party, and thus they always cook the books accordingly, just like a crooked mob accountant. But there exists a very real possibility that the number of otherwise healthy children under 18 who have died solely as a result of the great communist Chinese Wuhan Kung Flu coronavirus of 2019 is 0. The number is a vanishingly small one, even when they cook the books in service of their preferred political narrative, but we're slowly finding out that these mortality numbers have about as much of a relationship with objective reality as Stacey Abrams does with portion control. That kid with end-stage leukemia who's laying on her deathbed? We've got a positive COVID test here. This changes everything. She might have recovered from that end-stage leukemia, if not for the ravages of the dreaded China virus. It's the same thing they've been doing for years and years now with smoking-related deaths, quote unquote, where, of course, if you get hit by a train on your way to the store to buy a pack of smokes, the CDC will record gleefully and without hesitation that you were killed by the scourge of tobacco. And as we discussed at some length 2 episodes back, our public health agencies are being run now by people, by and large, who were formerly professional tobacco controllers. So they are cooking the books with COVID just the same as they learned to do with their fake made-up statistics on tobacco mortality. And they are using exactly the same nonsensical scientific arguments, the same spurious appeals to emotion that they used, and with great success, in implanting the myth of secondhand smoke into the public consciousness. But the goal of all these things never changes. It is to degrade your autonomy as an individual, to neuter your ability to function as a free citizen in a free society, and to bolster their own power. That is all any of this has ever been about. And we still retain the power, should we choose to exercise it, to put a stop to this crap with immediate effect. If they try to reimpose the stupid mask mandates and the screamingly illegal vaccine mandates, then everybody in the country who disagrees should go on strike. Call it the general strike of the reasonable. We will stay home, we will keep our kids out of school until these policies are revoked, period. Full stop. And what the hell are they going to do about it? If the government mask tyrants decide to play hardball, then we will be ready. If it comes to where we have to educate our kids at home, we'll get together and form homeschooling pods where each day of the week a different parent takes the day off from work and does the teaching for the whole group. Tens of thousands of people are doing this already, and each kid who gets pulled out of the public schools, they do not get paid for. Because the thing they really care about is getting their money for your kid being present in the classroom. They do not give 2 squirts of piss about turning out high school graduates who can't count to 3 if you spot them the 1 and the 2. They didn't lose anything from a year of ridiculous fake Zoom school because as soon as your kid logged on the laptop, they were counted as present and the school got their money. But with the schools open and mask mandates in effect, every kid who's not physically present, they do not get paid for. As the number of those kids adds up, then the racket becomes unsustainable. And please, let's stop pretending public education is anything but a racket at this point. If the last year and a half has taught us anything, it is that in the 21st century, public schools do not exist to serve the interests of parents and children. They exist exclusively to serve the interests of the teachers' unions and the Democrat politicians who rely on the campaign cash and the blocks of captive votes that those teachers' unions always dutifully deliver. What, you thought they cared about education? How quaint. There has to be a point where decent people, of all backgrounds, of all demographics, of all political proclivities, agree in sufficiently large numbers that they will not tolerate their children being mistreated so monstrously. And they will draw the damn line in the sand. I thought we would have passed that point last summer at the latest, maybe early fall. But I'm still waiting, confused and befuddled that so many of my countrymen have such apparently boundless tolerance for watching their sons and daughters being mistreated for political gain by horrible, evil, mendacious, corrupt liars. But I await, as I trust you do as well, the day when we, as a people, recover our moral courage. If not for ourselves, then at least for our progeny, who have no one but us to protect them from this stuff. Here is wishing everyone a delightful, edifying weekend. Happy anniversary to my mom and dad tomorrow. See you Monday. Get off my lawn.